And Mike, we recently heard from a listener who said, I only joined God's beautiful family at Easter this year, and I'm a huge fan of the show. God truly works through you and blesses your listeners. Thank you for sending in your encouragement. It really is
That's
a
an
blessing to hear
encouragement.
that. Yeah. Wonderful.
Welcome to the family.
Yes, welcome. Here's an email we got from Clay. The church seems so confused by false teaching today. I've been listening to this show for a while, and you guys often do a good job of being hopeful. I would love to know more about that and hear about what you see in the church that gives you hope.
They must be talking about me being hopeful.
Yeah.
Because you're so pessimistic and negative.
Yeah,
right?
It's all bad.
No, folks, the only reason that Adriel and I are hopeful is because of the promise that Jesus gave in Matthew 16:18. I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. You think of your own individual life. When we look at ourselves and our growth in holiness and all the errors that we have in our thinking, it's easy to lose hope. But when we look outside of ourselves to Jesus Christ and his promise, I will never leave you nor forsake you. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. What he began, he will finish. When we read those, we look outside of ourselves to the promise of the gospel, then we're cheered. And so I don't think that Adriel and I are sort of optimistic in a general way, that maybe, it's just our tendency to say the glass is half full instead of half empty. It's really the promise. That's what we have to go on. That's why Jesus says in Luke 12, verses 6 and 7, do not be anxious. God cares for every sparrow. He'll certainly take care of us. And all who confess him, Jesus as the Messiah, will be saved, we're told. And then Jesus adds in verse 32, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. So, you raise a great question, Elmer Fudd here. You raise a great question, Clay, and one that I've asked sometimes, but the good news is we're not building the church. Christ is. We're receiving a kingdom, not building it. It's an inheritance. We've inherited this kingdom. And in this life, just as we are simultaneously justified and yet sinful, we are also, the church itself is simultaneously holy in Christ and yet filled with corruption and, unfortunately, false teaching.
Mm-hmm.
We read in 2 Timothy 2, verses 15 to 19, do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. But, he continues to tell Timothy, avoid irreverent babble, for it will lead people into more and more ungodliness, and their talk will spread like gangrene. Boy, don't we see that. Among them, he says, are Hymenaeus and Philetus, who have swerved from the truth, saying the resurrection has already happened. They are upsetting the faith of some. But God's firm foundation stands, bearing this seal. The Lord knows those who are his. So within the visible church, there are some who are goats and not sheep, and they will only be separated on the last day. The church right now is a mixed body. But here's the good news. God knows those who belong to him. And God warns us that false teachers will always be in the church until Christ returns, 2 Peter 2:1. But false prophets also arose among the people in the Old Testament, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. But we have hope, Clay, because Jesus has already overcome Satan. Satan can no longer deceive the world. The gospel goes out freely and is bringing people from every tribe and tongue and nation into the kingdom. He knows who are his, and he's bringing his people into his kingdom. And that's the hope the basis for the hope that we have.
Yeah, and when you're plugged into the local church, you get to see that kingdom breaking in. I'll just share a story. Recently, something that was encouraging to me, talking to a woman and we were talking about the gospel and trying to explain the fact that the gospel is good news. And she had only heard her entire life when she thought about the gospel, she assumed that the gospel was, well, you do holy things, you do good things. I said, no, that's the law. Those are God's commandments. That's what he calls us to do. The gospel is not what you do. It's something that's been accomplished for you. Mm-hmm. It's Jesus' life, death, resurrection for you. And it was like the light turned on in her head.
Wow.
And she said, I always assumed that the gospel, Christianity, was about what we do, being a moral person, mm-hmm. not what God did for me. And then all of a sudden, it was like I could see it become good news in her mind. And those are the kinds of things, Christopher, that I think just give us a massive amount of hope. It's getting to see the kingdom break in our lives, in our churches, through moments like that.
Absolutely.